The Confederate insurrection has actively conducted voter fraud campaigns, which generates double agents inside the United States government, loyal to the Confederacy, operating illegal operations with federal and state powers. And thus, these positions generate various tricks in order to undermine and certify false elections. And these false elections include, but are not limited to, the censorship of speech, which includes, but is not limited to, money. And speech, being money, is a part of the free market. But, under the position of their enforcement of communism for the white supremacists, they are using these terrorist operations to undermine the capacity for the free market to exist, as they actively tamper with it, generating the enforcement of their centrally planned economy. And this centrally planned economy, on the basis of Lindsey Graham's criminal Confederate war, generates the economic warfare or economic violence. And this position generates substantive changes to the market, including threats and intimidation, such as the threats of assault and poisoning. And these subversions actively engage in political violence. And to this manipulation generates the obligation of the investigation through the duel, which would acknowledge the obstructed values first and foremost by the motive of the insurrectionists engaged in that subversion, such as, but is not limited to, the function of the military industrial educational complex, which pretends the authority without legal right of false experiments, which generates terrorisms, tortures, abuses, and harassments of political prisoners who, by definition, should have been protected from these subversions, such as, but is not limited to, the Confederate prisons, which have holding places for people who are being investigated, who are presumed innocent, and thus continue to be abused despite the presumption of innocence, as it is an active trade in the black market, hacking the function of the general society, which collapses the general economy into compliance with their objectives as they trade the crimes on Wall Street and other financial affairs, which have the equipment in order to manage their criminal rackets, which allows them to engage in the function of the proof of who is more evil and subversive in favor of the Confederacy, which allows them to launder this corruption into the general economy, which gives the false promotions of business, which is the enforcement of the white supremacist economy. And thus you have the centrally planned economy for the white supremacists, which is communism by wizard communists, which derives who does and who does not have speech. This is a long-term strategy conducted by many of the banks and other institutions such as Wall Street, which have actively engaged in white-collar crimes mostly and actively maintain a felony racket, which includes the contracting of Marines and law enforcement of various kinds, which have actively reinforced Jeffrey Epstein amongst other criminal rackets, which are part of this Confederate operation under Lindsey Graham's purview as his preferred position of Confederate operations for systemic racism in the enforcement of that communism. This requires the acknowledgement and release of that information, which generates our specific understanding of which trades to make and which trades to ignore, at which point the capacity for this centrally advanced objective certifies your capacity to reform a free economy, and in that relates the original values obstructed. And so, with this in mind, many of the traumatized communities targeted by the false military policy position from Lindsey Graham's Confederate insurrection stating that they can label any group, area, or individual an enemy combatant without due process, which has historically been used against the black community, amongst others, so that they could be traumatized and then defamed and recycled. And thus, the position of their defects being from secrets means that there's an occult knowledge of obstructed information, which substantively changes how the situation looks. And that change on how the situation looks materializes the alternate opinion of the general public as they are digesting and redistributing fraud. Thus, the records having been polluted and broken the chain of custody in order to have made these changes systemically alters the outcomes of each and every election and economic exchange. And to this extent, you have a substantively different market where these terrorisms have operated from, generating the acknowledgement of those who are more important to the American system being targeted by those Confederates engaged in the insurrection, which have generated and created the Nazi political party in Germany, forming Hitler, amongst other affairs, which, being their own, were then crushed as Hitler referred to the things provided to them. Some they were doing, and some they may not have been doing, which generates the acknowledgement that the Project Overcasts and the Project Paperclip, amongst other affairs, would have redigested these Nazis back into the general public, ignoring the malice and subversion of each of the dedicated enemies who have been ingested, and thus protected amongst the intelligence community's false security against the enforcement of law, and the protection of these individuals under the intelligence protections of the false executive privilege theory and the unitary executive theory, giving the executive authority over all other branches, breaking the constitutional co-equal branches, which was ignored and completely designed to be destroyed by the Confederacy, including but not limited to the monster on Jekyll Island, which manufactured the complete contempt of the Constitution as to acknowledge it as being unenforceable, as the constitutional republic of these United States is their enemy, and thus they, being Confederates, are an enemy combatant to the American government. This requires a high-grade investigation, also referred to as the duel, which has acknowledged the elites of the American system without that obstruction, such as but is not limited to the targeted communities, such as those that would have survived if they had the proper insurance or did the necessary precautions in order to sustain themselves against the extortionary terrorists, who were then falsifying the records of their superiority on the basis of their thefts and armed robbery and other coercions, such as but is not limited to the retaliation against a black community, which, having succeeded and was then noticeably more successful than them, was then completely eradicated and flooded and turned into a lake. And to this extent, the position of erasing them in that genocide, creating a rewritten history where the white supremacists are in complete control of the pen, creates the natural outcome where you would understand that there is no such thing as a free market. There's only communism. There's no such thing as a free vote, as there is no American government to enforce it. There is only the active trades on the crime market, which generates these alterations. Now, upon investigation, you would generate an acknowledgement of the original elites who were targeted, and thus the larger figures in the economy and society and others, generates the most changes to everywhere else. So if you have one group that's worth 30% of something, then you're going to have a surrounding group that's going to easily be worth 20%. And thus you have a functioning 50% control over the general system on those trades directly. Now, if you base everything off of the 80-20 rule, then you can say that 20% get all of the success and do most of the work, and 80% just fall in line, means you're able to adjust those numbers accordingly, but it's not super significant as the 80-20 rule is of the whole, and the whole includes all of the other major competitions, so by definition, the subdividing of the market is an actively negotiated, uh, yelling pit, a chorus of screams as they actively exchange in the various capacities for the market, such as the stock market and the options market, etc. Now, as this is found out by the military intelligence and sold to the Confederate white supremacists, the terrorists are then contracted with the Marines and police and others who then enforce the terrorism. Now, what happens when you actively have a sheriff's department or series of sheriff's department who do not believe that they're restricted by the Constitution? Uh, you actively have the argument that they are the sheriff or the owner of the region, at which point they engage in those criminal extortions for the direct profits, as their traded abuses allows for the cultivation of the Confederates' wizard clan, which has infiltrated the government to conduct their satanic rituals, which are primarily abuse. And the more the abuse or destruction or corruption that they conduct, the more benefits they're able to naturally distribute uh, in the deals with the devil, which actively promotes them so that even if they uh, were challenged alternatively, the challenger would have to overcome the powers of the devil's trading with them, reinforced by the criminal markets, which has already polluted the vote, which has already created a foregone conclusion as it is not legally certifiable. You're always going to have a defective outcome. Now, these communists and Nazis and Confederates of every faction inside the market subsequently make these exchanges and trade in order to maintain their centralized power in favor of these arrangements, such as, but is not limited to, their prearranged conclusions concern certain policies which advance or clean or launder their Confederates' crimes into the larger public as it is maliciously advanced, which includes but is not limited to the function of town hall meetings where they have contracted members uh, to speak for them, which are engaged in specialized talents in order to manipulate the conversation in favor of their outcomes, which includes the terrorist threats and subversions by their secret technologies, but primarily is mostly charisma and crowd control by normal speech, which generates the average person who does not have that level of charisma to default, at which point the general public not having that charisma score has not specialized in that charisma as they are average people who have to deal with average things in life would by definition then be under the control of the scent wizard, manipulating the conversation and its inherent outcomes, increasing the criminal powers in favor of their satanic goals. As these terrorist threats and assaults continue, you generate the alternative outcome as the general public, being sheep, are then collapsed into shape and then corralled into their pre ordered self destructive fascist arrangements. Now, these systems from the military-industrial educational complex includes the active malice of the satanic rituals, which includes systemic abuse systems for minors, which are far worse than anything Jeffrey Epstein did, making Jeffrey Epstein, according to the black market, the lesser of two evils, which was actively used in their dark psychology, which, if you don't know, is doing the least amount of good in order to accomplish the most amount of evil, as most people are traumatized into the coercion, and thus you have voter fraud systemically throughout the system for those predetermined policies which they have certified, which will include in the future the collapse of Social Security. So, if that's something that you're interested in, then you need the Confederates to lose, and thus this entire system of subversion and abuse needs to collapse. Now, the arrangements, I don't have active contact with the information off the top of my head, but they are actively developing schools across the country, uh, specifically designed for bullying and abuse, which generates trauma. And the trauma based mind control systems are actively what they're trying to enforce, uh, such as, but it's not limited to, the intelligence operations and the connections to um, the psychology boards of each of the states, which would have to certify all of the crimes going on under this system, as corruption is the rule and not the exception. Now, these abuse based mind control systems generate conforming members of the general public who will then defect into whatever they're supposed to do, which alters the economy and the political landscape and the rest of it. And thus, the question is who controls the most amount of controlled people? And this is also mitigated by immigration, thus, the mass influx of the Democrats to put in more immigrants from outside of the system floods the general system, which increases and deflates the value of the vote as more people are voting from the immigration, which generates the substantive changes to the outcome uh, according to their strategies. Now, they, being a traumatized control group, include the CIA operations of attempted coups, such as, I believe it was, don't quote me on this, but I think it was Venezuela. Uh, Basically, they traumatize the general public, trying to get them to overthrow the government, and then they refuse to overthrow the government. And then, because the United States government was being leveraged for these traumas to exist, they then engaged in mass migration, seeking asylum from the terrorist operations from the CIA back into the United States, and then they have a legal claim to asylum in that position because the CIA was doing those abuses. They did need to be protected from it. And those abuses that got them to leave in favor of trying to get into the United States, which then was censored and thus put out in the wrong context, stating that we need to adjust our immigration policies as there are too many migrants is the problem because you're traumatizing them, but you remove the context of traumatizing them, and then you just have too many, you know, people looking for a free lunch. And that substantively is bad faith and fraudulent. Now, these traumas include the mass changes in the ebb and flow of the ever increasing um, amount of subverted members of the public, which decreases the actual influence of those who are capable and competent of making sober educated answers until the monopoly has fully controlled it, so that only the white supremacist wizards are able to make any substantive orders, which allows them to elect their false representatives for the Confederacy, who will then reinforce it, and thus unitary executive theory no longer has a use for the elected officials, who are little more than puppets, who will then be turned on under their communist magic as radicals dumb enough in order to have supported the insurrection, and thus they will be maliciously abused under the systems that they approved of, such as the distribution to the black sites, so that they too can be traumatized as a revenge for merely being incompetent enough to have said yes in the first place. With these crimes of insurrection in place because of the sedition, you actively have substantively changed the United States elected officials into Confederate officials. Now, if you want a legal election, then you have to remove the tampered with information, which means it cannot be certified. Now, the fraudulent certification of wittingly defrauding the government by certifying something you know is wrong nullifies the certification, as any custom without reason is fraud and thus void, and thus any act against the Constitution is void, and thus the function of their terrorist operations has nullified William Barr's precognition arrests on the basis of suspicions without reason, on the basis of the subversion of the due process clause for the Lindsey Graham's Confederacy, which generates the arrests, abuses, and subversions essential to the torture prisons for those who cannot be legally convicted of anything and thus presumed innocent, and thus the arbitrary tortures for the crime market sold primarily for the satanic rituals, which corrupts the abused and it corrupts the abuser, and thus the position of the prison guards are actively manipulated as they are being transformed and socially engineered and conformed into the Satanist ritual as an essential aspect of the satanic ritual, as they are corrupted into the service of their Lord Satan, whether or not they are witting participants in the cult rituals, they are witting participants in the ritual action, and thus they are converted and corrupted and intoxicated and addicted all the same, and thus their bodies have adjusted themselves and tailored themselves to the specific outcomes, generating a culture of coyotes for the Dark Lord. And this system has actively traded on the rape culture. With the absence of David, there is no functioning patriarchy, and thus it has been replaced by the abuser's rape culture. And that rape culture, applying Plato's conspiracy, essentially planned the sexual outcomes and opportunities for each of the parties, which actively reinforces their position, and thus all women have no control over their bodies and thus have become prostitutes for the Confederate wizards. And in the position that they are just distributing prostitutes, substantively changes the outcome on the basis of payments. And thus you have the female Gnostics who need the rapists in order to sustain themselves and their political influence as they absorb and extort and defraud and rob the political identity of women and collapse it so that all of the progress made by them or the homosexuals or any of the other groups participating in it have their political currency for their group to be completely spent by the spendthrifts who waste everything in favor of the exchange on the criminal market, collapsing all influence, which normalizes them in their state position, such as, but is not limited to, the historic position on the theory of black people who have actively been ridiculed and demeaned and diminished by these traumatizing operations. And these false experiments conducting psychological traumas systemically create the new cultures which reinforce the impoverished political currencies for that identity's group and accounts, normalizing the distribution of its complete collapse as they arrogantly rush towards the demise of running into the Lord of Ooz's grass as they are converted into insignificant, nonsensical ooze themselves, and thus they, being turned upon maturity into oozes, becomes equally poor by the Confederates' socialism. Because while everyone is equal, some are more equal than others, and thus separate but equal is enforced and cannot be challenged, as there is entirely nothing unfair whatsoever about these separations from those political identities and the variations, and thus the investment into each cannot be questioned, and thus you are censored if you bring up any challenge to the legitimacy of separate but equal. As you are recycled infinitely into poverty and insignificance, the wizards become exponentially more powerful and significant, and thus become unchallenged in the totalitarian dominatrix operations, which has normalized pedophilia as a cornerstone of their identity. It is important to understand that crony capitalism derived by the rich controlling the politicians is not capitalism at all, as the tampering has created a communist central planned outcome, and thus the crony capitalists have engaged in the subversion of that system, and thus cannot be overlapped into the accusation against a free society, which has systemically been undermined by these criminal operations, substantially changing the outcome, as many who have been elected to be rich are then put in a position of power, are then put in a position of being corrupted, are then put in a position of buying off officials, which includes judges and officers who then censor information, are then systemically given the advantage by this corruption. And these systems of insurrections designed by the Confederates, who created the Nazis for the blueprints of evil, wanted to ingest the Nazis in order to advance those systems of evil so that they become fundamental aspects of normal use of government covertly and then publicly. Thus, to support the white supremacist insurrection and its surveillance operations and abuses against David Bowles and other American elites without the subversion, creates the substantive changes to the outcomes, which requires them to be compelled to release the information, which includes the duel with the function of the orders of Congress, giving Congress's official orders to release the information, which generates the acknowledgement of the legal obligation, which then restores David to his faculties, which will then restore all of his agents processing the information and the violations from these investigations connected to policies which would have been violated, and thus a list of criminal accusations to be conducted against them on the basis of all of the specific due diligence, good faith reporting of each and every specific policy violated all of the quantity of times, specifically outlining their total liability for this position as Confederate insurrectionists. And the Confederates, being separatists fundamentally in their ideals, means that they were never American, and thus, as a parasite, seek to collapse the United States, and thus everyone who does not support these functions of removing all of the corruptions related to David, ending the sedition, would then, by definition, have to choose what country they stand with. If they are a foreign nation, then they are a foreign nation. If they are Confederate separatists, then they are Confederate separatists. If they are American, then they need to wake the fuck up and stop supporting the white trash insurrection. And in this regards, the rule of law of the United States being the obligation, requires them to subordinate themselves to that function, and thus will no longer have California's support of their criminal surveillance being able to create changes to the outcome, as their artificial intelligence generates substantial changes to their system as they are reabsorbing the information and corrupting it into the favor of prosecution, which is only paid for by convictions for the increasing of slaves, which, by definition, their targets, being abused and extorted by these means, are then converted by that process into the false position of guilty by illegal means from the Confederates' military operation, acquiring false confessions and others which have actively been tested in the Middle East from their illegal wars when they did 9/11 and used that false flag of Northwoods in order to justify the advancement of more blueprints, turning Nazi theory into practical reality. The censorship from the military industrial educational complex includes Project Mockingbird, which has violated the fairness doctrine in order to control the news outlets, which reinforces their predetermined answers, such as, but it's not limited to, when they were trying to make Britney Spears look crazy so that she could be subjugated to the conservatorship. And thus, their systemic abuses by secret and covert actions generates the reinforced positions as the expert charismatic reporting generates every specific weakness which was actively compounded and defected on itself, and thus allowed her to be put into the cycle of being controlled under that conservatorship for the abuse, which generates the psychological trauma and allows her to be controlled and manipulated, and in that position creates actual permanent effects and impermanent effects, which allows for exponential increased production of false evidence created by the manipulators covertly. And in that trauma based mind control system, they then permanently have control for the extortion and thefts, which allows them to ingest billions of dollars easily from the general public, uh, from that and many other uh, victims, which generates the normalized function of their engagement in the general public as they are engaged in slave raids, which again means that they do not have a right to convict the person by the evidence that is owed in discovery, which would have their confession to crimes um, admit that the target is innocent of all of the offenses and that it is an illusion enforced for the delusion of the records, which creates the systematic simulation for the general public, which accepts the malicious outcome by the white supremacist wizards, which would never be properly represented in the general public because they control all of the news outlets, which includes, but is not limited to, their white supremacist communism, which has removed all challenging news outlets, such as David's national news and political social media, which are his actual speech, which by definition substantively changes his political party uh, by their criminal military operations, which was estimated to be 100 million of the voters by the time he was 8, which would then be converted into the power brokering, increasing the influence. Now, if 50, what was it? If the subject was reduced to 300,000 active voters from various estimates, depending upon whatever the thing is currently, then that's 1/3, which generates a large influence for that base to engage in the power brokering, which increases by the trades of value with the other political parties from that base to the general 2/3, which then generates the ever increasing base, which increases the function negotiating powers with the rest of it, which then accepts its final limitation or cuts itself off for the advancements of keeping the market alive, which allows for the power brokering to actively trade in favor of the bulls exchange, which then would normalize the commission's exchanges and accepting the actual process for the legitimate vote on the basis of David's educated answer, which has the most influence with the general public for a sober educated answer, as his sober educated answer then would then be produced and distributed to the general public from those news operations from that power dynamics situation, actively preserving the commissions as the primary value over direct political power, turning the substantive real power into the illusion of power for David, which would then systemically increase the normal ingestion of his resources so that he can enjoy more luxurious alternatives, which is substantively necessary to the estimate for his original human decency, which may not be changed by law, and thus their inability to change status and their inability to change human decency requires them to return those resources and the mechanisms for those resources, which by definition, if they were going to do that, then they would have been loyal to the United States in the first place, but then they wouldn't have committed the crimes for the Confederates' insurrection, which would lead to the information that would disqualify the majority of David's competition, who, partaking in the deal with the devil, joined the insurrection and have permanently barred themselves from being legally allowed to be a part of the American government because of their support for treason, of aiding and giving comfort to enemies of war to the United States. And these malicious enemy combatants are to be removed from that system and are actively using the system as a collective retaliation, as David Bulls is stronger than them according to the legal market. It requires the entirety of the Confederacy, which has celebrated David as their superior, to collectively retaliate and reject him from being their Confederate leader, as he is not Confederate and thus is loyal to America, and thus is the white supremacist enemy according to these Confederate calculations. And the retaliation of the rape culture requires the total force of that Confederacy and its malicious rapist wizards. This culture of silence actively has the rich and the famous cooperate with these systems as they are mutually partaking in the system for their secret society operations, which allows them the specific benefits of each of those trades, but requires them to stay silent about all of the crimes, lest the system retaliate against them, similar how it has retaliated against David Bowles, acknowledging that David has, from that original estimate, been stronger than them, required them to attack him as an infant to be sacrificed to their Satanists in favor of their protection rackets of these criminal operations, which are the normal status quo function of their white supremacist loyalties. It is important to understand that the Iran-Contra program is one of the primary systems in the records that I have available. but can't publish as it is under government control, um, stating that their targeting of David is generated from the corruption from that, as the acknowledgement that David as the patriarchy would be the aristocracy choosing the Senate and thus would be the majority influence over the political elections, states that David is the primary individual choosing and forming and crafting the government, which by definition is then targeted by those corrupt systems from the Iran-Contra, which then forms David into the military intelligence oversight function of the White Hats fighting the Black Hats, which has actively been opposed in the Church Committee, which said that they need the White Hats in order to justify the continuation of the Black Hat operations, and that the White Hats would keep them in check, which is the acknowledgement of David's classified branch of the military for intelligence oversight, which was systemically then opposed and sought to be eradicated and defunded and gutted. At which point, that branch would already exist. The intelligence oversight would already exist. The enforcement military police would have already existed, and thus posed the greatest threat to the white trash Confederate operations, which led to those who revealed Iran-Contra to be arrested, and thus David having a legal right and obligation under that office's responsibilities to have disseminated against it, which would lead to Reagan's impeachment, which would lead for the control of the United States over the situation, had the retaliation of abusing David for the political prisoner functions to be sold for the abuse theater structure, which includes the malicious tortures against them from the satanic cults uh, rituals, which turns the elite into the corruption for the satanic system, and thus sought to completely destroy David's nation, which David's nation being killed becomes their religious manifestation of the biblical small horn of the beast in the apocalypse, and the small horn having the face of a man raised up and pushed out three of the other horns and spoke boastful, blasphemous things. And this is their objective, which requires the conversion of David as the American aristocracy to be converted by the ritual abuses to become this boastful horn. And the act of allowing him to be vulnerable to it is the act of supporting the resurrection of the once dead nation into the blasphemous horn loyal to the Antichrist system, as they can give David everything he's owed back at any point that they choose, as it is legally an obligation, thus giving the capacity to the resurrection of the dead nation. Now, to this extent, the Iran-Contra is also important, as the Nazi insurrectionists have actively been a part of the system which has corralled the Jews into the protocols of Erdel Zion, actively promoting the Israelis' corruption to convert them into the gimmick for the protocols, justifying Hitler's activity, which states in function that the genius Jew from England who invented TNT, I think, I forgot what his name is, but he deserves a Nobel Prize, uh, asked for nothing except for the restoration of the Jews to Israel. Now, this being a thing was also subtly traded on that crime market to remove any pretense of a constitution so that the Nazi loyalists could have strategic positions inside of the Israeli government, which by definition cannot tolerate the existence of a superior court being able to enforce a constitution against their actions, which would actively have trades with the Nazis who have infiltrated the other governments, including the United States government, which has contracted the forming of Revelation, which is the contracting of the Warren David's record of their uh, non-congressionally approved war against Israel, which will then automatically trigger actions without due process or the proper structures, which creates the war in Israel, which creates the hunting of all Jews around the world under the policies of the war on terror, which then creates the hunting of Jews and the eradication of Jews, and that compromising, as many of the Christian nationalist systems have corrupted the churches into Druidic loyalties for their satanic priesthood, has also created criminal abuse structures connected to those pastors and others, which would actively corrupt and manipulate and convert many of the Christians into the criminal rackets of the terror factory, which makes them guilty of terrorism, and thus the Revelation's position that Christians were given to the Antichrist and that the Jews were hunted around the world would then be fulfilled by this operation, which required all of these specific pieces, which they crafted on purpose in their suicide cult for the powers derived by their deal with the devil. The previous acknowledged position from the church committee about the white hats fixing the black hats position for the intelligence oversight function generates the military police's protection of the intelligence oversight operations, as all executive functions are subordinated by law to the legal procedure of checks and balances, such as the judicial orders and congressional oversight and orders. Thus, the legal limitations and publishings and distributions from this system would have secretly been operating for a long-standing period of time before that confession, which is an acknowledgement to its previous existence, which by definition led to the compromise of the intelligence of David's branch, facilitating the capacity to undermine it covertly, which subsequently changed by the activity of knowing the secret operations, was able to dismantle it by virtue of not being able to protect the classified materials, as it is systemically supported by enemies from the factions of the Confederacy, infiltrating the American government, conducting operations of espionage against the United States, gaining access to this information. And thus, the long standing period before that period of time was understood by them, which was projected by the military operations capacity to the foresight through their various techniques, which were actively reinforced, such as Reagan's wife, who believed in horoscopes, which was actively used in the position of projecting Libra Fire Tiger, which was actively the foundational position of converting Reagan on the basis of these horoscope projections, which has found the systems which have been encoded, and thus the code was broken by the white supremacist cipher in discovering American security's key weaknesses by compromising those secrets, and thus was able to engage in their subversion of David's family before he was born on the basis and assumption of David's activities in its essential protections of American interests, which includes the acknowledgement of JFK's currency from his executive order, which is one particular aspect of David's strategies from their projections on how to sustain himself against the insurrection, and thus that currency which David would have been using would have been immune to their inflation, as it would have been a network currency, and thus could not be overprinted, as its relationship to the network businesses and its treaties around the world saturates um, the businesses representing each piece of the currency, and thus is subject to extreme deflation, and thus maintains its substantive value, which is the convictions and the prosecutions and the fines would be set in this position so that that currency, being their punishment to pay, would then have to be processed into from the American currency and the USD, which is subject to the Wizard Communism's inflation and mass debts and others, which makes it exponentially more difficult for them to do anything as the inflation itself counteracts their capacity to pay those fines to the American federal government, which is David's department, which is the intelligence oversight of the United States Congress and the military police managing it. The American justice system's standard of normal punishments is separate to the system which would have systemically created its own series of policies under David's arrangements, which would have created his legal contracts for a sober educated answer, which includes the process of a sober educated answer for each election, which chooses the government elected officials, which chooses the votes for each of the policies and standard operating procedures, including the status quo acceptance of each of the judges not conducting judicial activism, and thus can be respected in the rule of law under precedent, which is being subverted by the white supremacist insurrection. Now, to this extent, you have that manipulation, which has created these substantive changes, which the Supreme Court has acknowledged that the substantive changes are necessary in order to create the court's order for the correction, which, having already been an acknowledged precedent, requires them to accept their same opinion, or they are creating a bias for themselves. If they change their opinion in order to fight David to collapse the United States, clearly there was a bias, and it is not, at that point, no longer considered an opinion of the court, and thus it would be judicial activism, and thus it would be a subversion of their office in bad faith, disqualifying them from office, requiring their removal and correction as they require aggressive punishments for the subversion in that bad faith action of challenging David Bowles in any way, shape, or form, as he is their superior in law under this affair, as the law is the centralized power of an impartial third party, which they acknowledge that David, being in the weeds of the law, is superior to this in this effect. Challenging him is to challenge the entire competency and legitimacy and right to exist of that law itself, and thus their carpet bombing of the wickets of the law, of the weeds of the law, of the forest of the law, entangle themselves into being an enemy combatant, and thus must be held as a terrorist insurgent without a legal government, engaged as an enemy combatant, using the weapons of the extortion of their stolen powers from the office against the law, making them an enemy combatant to be treated in a black site according to their position as a terrorist insurgent for insurrection, all of which disqualified them from office, compelling their defect to judgment to immediate support of David's complete restoration under the order. And if there is not an American executive to enforce it, then it is still their responsibility to give that order. The disconnected secret operations being investigated and systematically put together for the original agreement, all of which would have, under the classified position, been unwilling to admit to under that structure, were then systemically attacked by the white supremacist terrorist operations, in these malicious insurrectionist programs. The terrorist operations engaging in these substantive changes alters the economy as the terrorist subversions create the illusions for the delusion and watering down of the courts, which materializes the change of property ownership as they substantively craft the economy in their image. Thus, the white trash have made a dumpster, and thus the system is systemically getting ready to collapse on the fraudulent creation of the monopolies, which are formed by the actual Nazi fascists in the forming of the bubbles, which substantively changes the economy, collapsing into place, falsifying the laundered economy in favor of the crime markets.